Hey everybody, what's up? It's Booksy. Today is June 29th. This is Thursday. This is an update for APE and AMC. I'm going to kind of actually do my best to keep it brief. I don't think we need a major update. If you watched the video a couple days ago, I really just talked about the spring. And I said, here's some things that could happen, and then here's what would be ideal. And we went through a lot of stuff. Okay, so there were a lot of different minor scenarios here and there. Well, we got the scenario that was in some ways kind of my least favorite, which is you get a pump early. And specifically, we're talking about AMC pumping, not APE. APE had this pullback period for a little while AMC was doing kind of a big move to the upside. It started with a crawl, and then there was a breakout over the creek, and then it jumped really far, 10%, as you all know, very quickly, and then dropped down and has kind of landed today around 0%. It's up 0.23%. It's not a bad thing. And I'm going to talk about APE as it relates to AMC just a little bit here. We're going to bounce through the four major charts: APE, AMC, the combo chart, and then the deviation chart. We'll start with APE. So APE had a descending wedge this afternoon, right around 1 p.m. Well, a couple hours anyways before close. It broke to the upside, raced up quite a bit, all the way to 181. You can see that it actually stopped right on this marker, and this line that I've got is very significant. I usually don't keep these kinds of things up unless they're important. And in this particular case, you can see why. The last two times we had major upward movement to distribute back in April, and then in March, it was kind of like the beginning, I suppose you could say, of this range. This came after we had a major drop from the tip top. And so I created this downward angle. I think of this as kind of a head and shoulder. And I talked about this in the last video as well. It's not meant to be perfect because, again, I think this is an awkward right shoulder if it is one. I'm talking about an inverted head and shoulder here. You got to remember the point of a head and shoulder, the point of even that, the reason why we can analyze something like that and understand how it works is because when you look at the left shoulder versus the right shoulder, there's a difference in volume, there's a difference in direction. Usually it adjusts, it shows you an adjustment or a change of direction that's occurring. And so it's an observation of essentially either supply or demand weakening. So if you look at something like this and you're like, man, that's just way too big for a right shoulder, I would gently agree with you and say, yeah, you're probably right. As a pattern, that's not the best way to maybe describe this. But the line, right, the supply line that's being tested here has existed for a long time, okay, and probably even goes way back. And so the reason I kept this on the chart is, yeah, there's a breakout target here. We mentioned that that could happen. It was up here around like 232, which really, if you look back, is this very first, we call it like an LPSY or sign of weakness before it started dropping down. It would need to get above 210 to do that, and it's had some trouble. I think a lot of it has to do with Antara's heavy amount of selling, but clearly there's a demand here for this stock. Now, I will say this, okay, right now it's doing this kind of creek jumping motion. This particular price action that we saw at the end of the day today looks a lot like the end of the day last week on Wednesday into Thursday before that big jump. So is it possible this thing's going to have a major leap to the upside on news tomorrow? Possibly. But I will say that from a technicals perspective, just in general, while that is a good thing that we kind of came back down, checked this level, filled the gap, and then pushed to the upside, you know, it did lose its mild trend that it had. There's no doubt about that. It did have a distribution here. The volume on this bottom is kind of like so-so. You know, there's a lot of shakeouts going on. And then the fact that it came up and rejected on that 181, you know, it's a bit nerve-wracking. You can see the similarities. I'm not going to point it out. That it's possible this thing gets another nice pump, but it's widening, which tells me that the spread is, right? The distance traveled, which tells me that there's a possibility here that sellers are really pushing back hard. It's not even like a possibility. It's a kind of a given. Sellers are pretty much pushing back as hard as they can here. And I think it might, again, be a reflection of the bigger players who are selling, not necessarily majority of people, okay? But just majority of who owns all the shares, right? Hundreds of millions still. So hopefully we're going to find out that Antara is out of this and we don't have to worry about them anymore. So tomorrow I'm going to be really watching this area where we're at right now as a creek level. Don't want it to pour back down. Really needs to get back above 175 if it's going to have any kind of strength. That's my kind of key level right now. It's sitting on a previous support and resistance. Really was a resistance back here a few days ago, right around that 175 level. So we need to get above that and like hold that. And I think if we do, there's a strong chance that news could propel this to the upside. What about AMC? Well, AMC did the exact opposite of what I was hoping it would do. And I mentioned in the video, I don't want to sound like I'm trying to be defensive or anything, but I did say it. In the video, I said, maybe the worst case here would be if it pumps to 450 first, making everybody think it's going to run, or even higher, like coming all the way up to like 5 something back to this creek, and then has a distribution. There's not a rule set that says you can't do something like that. Like we can always go back to a previous supply and demand zone and distribute somewhere other than where we are. Here's my thought on why, first of all, like why 450? Well, there was a gap. That's easy. The gap needed to be filled. Second of all, what about this idea of going up, period? Why would you go up if you want to sell off? If you think this is going to go down for a spring, why have this big fancy show? Well, you want FOMO so that you can sell, and you want to enlist sellers. The other thing is that when this thing pushes up, okay, I'm watching volume really carefully. There's a high amount of volume in this move, and then it goes back to basically average. And then this secondary move, while it does have pickup in volume, is notably lighter in volume as well. It has become on the 1 hour overbought very quickly here when it got to the top. And then again, it's climbing back to that overbought territory right now. This has a lot of similarity to a previous couple of areas from an iterative standpoint. Let me switch my chart here. From an iterative standpoint, this has a lot of similarity to a number of other kind of hooks that we've seen. Namely this guy back here. I think this is probably one of the best examples. In this region that occurred in March and that drop down, we had a major turn, and that turn was this big U-shaped thing. And it started by doing what? Well, filling that gap. If you look at this, I don't want to say canonically, like this is like Star Wars or something. If you look at this like as if you're reading it through the lens of iterations, and we've talked about this quite a bit, this particular drop down right here could be interpreted as one of two things. You could interpret it as this entire area, or you can see this whole thing as this whole thing. I don't think it matters that much. The basic understanding of this is it looks like a big cat ear paw. We get this every time we distribute. You can see it right here. There's a big cat ear paw. There's a big cat ear paw. We get it every single time. There's an upthrust. There's a secondary upthrust on weaker volume. Sometimes it goes higher. Usually that double top is met by a very last upthrust, kind of a gasp, right? And that's typically that right ear. And the right ear usually looks like it's chopped off. It has a little bit more sideways action, almost always, all right? And we can go back and look at how we interpret that from the master fractal and all this other junk. But look, it's not complicated. It's everywhere on this chart. You can see them, here. You can see them with these double tops and then the final like sell-offs. It's all over the place, okay? This is a very large version of it, and I think a lot of it's due to volume and probably the operator change. I think it's a positive sign. So what would this be if this is a major drop that occurred and then you've got this really rounded bottom? A lot of people are going to look at this and say, oh, it's a cup and handle or something forming. Well, it's already dropped below 50%, I believe, of the height of the bull. So I think it's already not a very strong cup and handle. But typically AMC doesn't bottom like this. It usually bottoms with strength, and it makes sense with a spring action that is more pointed. It's possible that we won't get something like that and that this could be the bottom. And it's similar to what you might have experienced back in 2020 with that kind of rounded bottom. But the spring action itself, you can't see it here. This is the 2020 fractal. It is in this very, very sharp dip. We didn't really get that, and we didn't get a spring. We didn't go below, 375. We were very close. Instead, we pumped up high. And there's a couple things I just want to note. So number one, if you look at the way the creek crosses work, and if you go back and look at these particular creek crosses where there's like these cat ear kind of things, right? You get this rounded bottom with an early jump. You come back and consolidate, and then you get a secondary jump. In this case, goes back and fills the gap. This is pretty common. It's not exactly the same way every single time, but you see this quite a bit on AMC where you've got this kind of early pump before a final dump. On the macro, you can see it all over the place, right? There's this kind of early stop before the drop, early stop before the drop. Going back even further, you can see the cat ears here do something pretty similar as well, right? There's kind of early jumps and then there's major drops. In this case, they don't go lower. And then this is a fractal that I've been using quite a bit because it's very similar in terms of like the pacing to what we're experiencing right now. And likewise, this has a kind of final push. Like notice right here that this particular area right there is very similar to what we're experiencing right now. And there's some early moves that happen, on these jumps where you're kind of leaping over the local creeks. Like in this case, you're jumping over the local creek before the final drop. This happens pretty much all over the place on AMC. So if we were to say like there's a change of character, it wouldn't be, it jumped over the creek and pumps up without checking it and all this other stuff. It has to be always, it's going across, and then before it gets that hook and drops, we have to kind of wait and see. So we're in this position right now because we didn't make a bottom. It did jump a local creek here. That was part of this big move. You can see it right there. It's not over till it's over, okay? And I know that people are going to be like, it's going to the moon right now. Maybe it happens and never goes down for a spring. But liquidity seems to still demand it, so I don't feel like that's the case. And just like when we were up here and just like when we were right here, I said the same thing over and over again. Maybe it happens to change character here. Maybe it happens to change character here. Maybe here. But here's what has to happen. So here's what has to happen in order for this to be a change of character right now. This would need to come up and break out from this trend right there, which means and above this trend right here. These are parallels, right? And you need to get back up basically to the $5 area and find support. If that were to happen on some strength, high volume, and then we see continuation, I'm then looking for the next major jump down. And to me, it's not complicated. I'm using these parallels quite a bit, almost religiously. It needs to get over them. It just does. You cannot expect anything else other than downside if you can't get over this. And so this is my main one that I've been using. I know it's a mess, but you got to get up over here. And I know that's far away. Y'all are like, well, that's at 575. Why would I want to buy there instead of buying here? Well, because previously when it's pumped, it's faked us out. So for the idea of us going up to like 540 scares me because I worry that if it does have that initial break and push up, everybody FOMOs in and then we actually get a major drop. And you might say, well, that couldn't happen if it goes up that far. No. It happens all the time. This is a prime example right here. So in this particular breakdown that occurred, we have this initial major push to the upside, and then it still goes lower, right? And this happened on that news. So is it possible that this double drop kind of scenario happens again, and we end up with this kind of fake out push to the upside, and then it dumps? Yeah. I think from just a basic, here's what I'm seeing kind of perspective, To me, I feel like we've already kind of made the big move. We filled that gap. It's very similar to the way this gap was filled and then sort of chopped up and sideways. If it breaks to the upside, I'm still going to be waiting to see what happens way up here. That's just me. You can always hedge for it if you think it could go up farther. But for right now, I don't particularly see this as like we're moonshotting. I think it jumped the creeks. I jumped a couple local creeks here. It had a big buy-in. There's a lot of sell-off that happened, and then we kind of cooled off. Now we're going into some major news events. I think you're going to see that it's very similar, probably, to something like this, where you're kind of setting up just above how where you want to go. And remember, this past time, it did the same thing. It had made a bottom, pretty flat bottom around 415, and when we dropped, we came beneath 415 and then went even further. So it's not that this has to drop significantly far. I've got this thing drawn up like this, but frankly, it could be very much like this. I mean, there's nothing to say that it has to be super, super far. It just doesn't. The only requirement for a spring is that we get somewhere beneath 375, and that has to do with bottoms that we've made previously. Do I think there's other targets? Yeah, I think there's some lower targets around 350 and 335 that probably could get hit in a major sell-off. So here's where we are right now. On the hourly, we're getting into that overbought territory. Okay, it's very similar in some ways to what's happened previously on these walkdowns, where you get this kind of major relief move and then there's another drop. I still think that based on the fact that we broke down here, this should not be thought of as like super bullish just yet. I don't believe that, and I could double check this, but let me try on another chart. It might be a little bit cleaner. I don't believe that it's done anything right now that warrants me saying like it's absolutely going to be flying to the moon in a day. I could be wrong, I'm only human. And frankly, this thing's going to run when it wants to, but we've done a pretty good job so far of saying yay or nay. And I don't think my track record has been that questionable. I really don't. Those of you who've been following know that we've done a pretty good job of saying yay or nay. So this right here is what I'm looking at, and I think that this is just a major hook. We're going to see what happens. Obviously, we can't rule anything out just yet, but this is, to me, is sort of what I'm looking at, and I think that, again, with a lot of similarity, it doesn't have to be exactly the same, but with a lot of similarity, it reminds me of this kind of big hook that happened here before it dropped down and tried to go a bit lower. These are things that we can keep in mind as we move forward. And this guy particularly, had this kind of rounding that dropped down. And then we have this distribution that got us back below. Now we're in that same pocket, rounding, possible drop down. If you take a look at VRVP, which is your liquidity, I don't know really why, but for some reason, they keep jumping over this 425 level. It's been heavily sold. This 425, it's not been heavily bought yet. So again, why go up? Well, you're checking the creek, you're filling a gap, and I think there's a lot more sellers up here than there are down here, okay, for now. But all that being said, has selling relented yet? Well, the answer is no, not really. This whole area has been a lot of pumping and dumping. It's very distributive, and we really haven't seen a lot of sign of life until right around here. So I believe that this still has the same markings or very similar markings to that March run-up, but I think that it still needs to get a spring. It's not impossible that this pushes up here, recaptures some critical level, and then starts running. But I'm not happy about it because we want the spring. You want this to be over. And a liquidity check like that with a big rebound that finds support is the most surefire kind of, yeah, it's going type thing. An LPS here makes me nervous that this is going to last a lot longer, potentially coming up and then coming back down in the future. So I don't like that. When I look at AMC plus APE, okay, and this is my formula chart. Same deal. You've got some early creek crosses. You can see it's jumping the creek, it's jumping the creek. There's a bit of a wedge forming, right? It's a bit of a wedge, a bit of a head and shoulder. You can see there's a bit of a head and shoulder here, and there's also kind of a wedge forming. This is very typical for cat ears to have that second ear and then have a hook. It's very possible that this is like an iterative type move. When this thing typically breaks down, and I know this is going to be a weird comparison to make, but there is often like a wedge type shape, right, within the cat ears. It's not always like perfect, and it doesn't have to be. Sometimes you see that head and shoulder more than you'll see the wedge, you know what I mean? But it's usually there, okay? It's very triangular. Again, this is not the best example right here, but I'm just trying to give you like a simple, like, here's what it kind of looks like. There's another one like right in here. And this is very strewn, like drawn out, okay? There's often like a narrowing of the spread that appears to be a bit of a wedge action. And then typically, again, you might see that, hey, that looks like a head and shoulder, and it does. On AMC, it doesn't always look like that when you go back and look at it, but it often does. And that's very typical. We see that all the time. It was one of the things back here that made me think that this was not over, that it was going to distribute. And especially in that master fractal, if you look at the right side of that master fractal, it starts with this big head and shoulder that also looks like a pennant. Now you might be saying, this is completely different. This pennant looks a lot healthier. It doesn't have these like anemic, push-ups. I don't disagree. I think you're right. This does look healthier, but it still has the markings of that head and shoulder. And until it breaks to the upside, it's not over. Pennants do not always break the direction you think they're going to break. This one, although it's going downward, and I believe it will eventually break to the upside, it does not have to, okay? And there's nothing preventing this from going down and having a quick drop to the downside before it goes to the upside. There's often fake outs in pennant breaks. So again, step by step, where are we? What's next? This is the same kind of line I drew on the other chart right here. I have it anchored on those two bottom points. You can see that we're kind of dangling right there on a hook region, and we might get a reversal here. We'd have to hold this level tomorrow around 270. So all of that being said, if APE decides that, yeah, it's going to go to the upside, and you can see it's gapping up, it seems like it wants to do it, just like it did over here. Maybe it will. If APE goes to the upside and ends up being at like $2, that's going to raise the value of the formula chart by quite a bit, but it's going to be heavily dependent on what we see with AMC, which is currently down 3 cents. It's not a lot, but my point being that, look, we had this kind of a gap after this move in March. I don't think it's unfair or to say that something similar might happen tomorrow on news, and we got to be kind of have your wits about you, like keep your spidey senses active. You don't want to be in a situation where you're caught off guard. Do not assume this thing's flying just because it had a good couple of days. Please don't do that. Just be patient with it. I would highly advise that you have ideas of where you would have confirmation. Like I'm telling you, like these are areas I'd have confirmation. A flush to the upside when you're expecting a spring, maybe not that, maybe you're not wrong, maybe you're just early, you know what I mean? Like you could just be in a situation where a gap down is going to occur and reset some stuff, and then we're going to see a move. So that's all I'm going to say about it today. I hope you guys have a good one. I will try my best to stream some tomorrow, which is Friday. And I hope you have a good one. We'll talk to you later.